It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a lament. In thousands of accounts of World War I, that question is often uttered with the strangest tone astonishment. Imagine you're there, 1916, the Somme front, or maybe Passchendaele. You've just run across no man's land. The whistling of artillery shells tears through the air. A massive explosion hurls you into the air. You fall into the mud. You try to get up to keep running. The command is to keep going. Your brain orders your legs, get up, run. But your body collapses. You look down, and your world crumbles. Welcome to your channel name. Today, we're not talking about strategy, not about medals. We're going to talk about the most terrifying moment in a soldier's life, the moment they realize they've left a part of their body on the battlefield. To understand why the phrase, "What's wrong with my leg?" became a shared nightmare for an entire generation, we must first look at the nature of this war. World War I was humanity's first industrial war. It was unlike any war before it. In Napoleon's time, a rifle bullet could penetrate soft flesh and break bone, but it was a clean wound. In World War I, the destruction came from artillery. More than 70% of casualties in World War I were due to artillery fire. Shrapnel-sharp, hot pieces of steel the size of a hand, or as small as a finger, flew at supersonic speeds. When a shell explodes near the ground, the trajectory of the shrapnel often sweeps low. And what is at the lowest level? Those were the legs of the soldiers. Infantry soldiers were trained to lie flat on the ground at the sound of whistling. But when they lay down, or when they were running hunched over their legs, became their most vulnerable targets. A surgeon at a field hospital in Ypres wrote in his diary, "We no longer counted the dead, we counted legs." There were days when trucks carrying wounded soldiers arrived and the floor was covered in blood. Strangely, wounds from artillery shells often completely blew away the lower limbs or crushed them to the point where only a thin flap of skin and a uniform trouser leg remained. The brutality of modern weapons has created a generation of men who are incomplete. But even more terrifying than the physical wound is the reaction of the human brain to it. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to lose a leg? Most of us imagine an immediate, excruciating pain, that the soldier would scream in agony. But in reality, based on hundreds of memoirs, the truth is far quieter and far more terrifying. When a shrapnel fragment cuts through bone and flesh, the central nervous system is overloaded. A massive amount of adrenaline is pumped into the bloodstream instantly. This is humanity's ancient survival mechanism, fight or flee. The brain temporarily disconnects from pain receptors in the injured area to keep its owner conscious and escape danger. Arthur Robinson, a British Army private, recounted his experience at the Battle of the Somme. "It felt like someone hit me hard in the calf with a baseball bat. That's it. A hard, numb blow. I fell. I thought I'd tripped over barbed wire. I tried to get up and run after my comrades. I braced myself against the mud, put my weight on it, and fell again. I cursed. I looked down to see what root had tripped me." Arthur hadn't tripped over any root. His right leg had been amputated at the knee by a mortar shell fragment. That was the moment of negative rejection. In the first few seconds, or even minutes after the injury, the soldier didn't know he had lost a leg. Their brain was still sending signals down to their toes. They could still feel their toes gripping the soles of their shoes. They could still feel the weight of their body pressing down on their heels. This is the phenomenon of phantom limb, appearing even before they see the wound. They try to stand up on a leg that no longer exists. They fall. They try to stand up again. A tragic loop unfolds between mud and corpses. They don't understand why their bodies won't obey them. Confusion, not pain, is the dominant emotion at this moment. Then the moment arrived. The moment his eyes met reality. When his third attempt to stand failed, the soldier stopped. He looked down. His khaki uniform was tattered. Blood didn't gush out like in the movies, because severed blood vessels usually contract immediately due to trauma and shock, or are blocked by mud. It was a jumble of flesh-bone fragments and black mud. A former French soldier described it in a letter to his wife in 1917. He looked down at what he thought was his leg. It looked like a piece of raw meat thrown in a butcher's shop covered in mud. Where were his shoes? Where was his foot? He looked around, thinking it might be nearby. He wanted to pick it up. A crazy thought, he knew, but at that moment, he really wanted to pick it up and put it back in place. The question, "What's wrong with my leg?" was uttered at that moment. It was a question to oneself, and also a cry for help sent into the void. At this point, the shock began to shift. From the exhilaration of adrenaline to the coldness of blood loss, the cold began to creep in. Not the cold of a French winter, but a cold from within the spinal cord. As consciousness returned, the pain began to break through the brain's defenses. But it wasn't a sharp pain, but a burning sensation, as if someone were pressing a red-hot iron rod against the stump. The soldiers around were often the first to realize it, even before the victim. You could see the eyes of your comrades. They looked at you, then down at your feet, and then turned away in horror. In World War I, there was an unwritten rule. Don't tell the wounded how serious their injuries were. You're only slightly scratched, buddy. That was the most common lie on the Western Front. But their eyes didn't lie. After realizing he had lost his leg, the real battle began. Not a battle against the Germans or the Austro-Hungarians, but a battle against time. The soldier lay there at the bottom of a waterlogged artillery crater. He couldn't move. He knew that any sudden movement would only make the blood flow faster. He pulled out his personal first aid kit. A tiny roll of gauze. It was too small for this horrific wound. They tried to apply a tourniquet. Shoelaces, belts, or the drawstring of a munitions bag. Anything that could be used to tighten. They tied their thighs together so tightly that the flesh turned purple to stop the flow of life. And they waited. Waiting in World War I was a psychological torture. The stretcher bearers couldn't arrive immediately. The shelling was still going on. The snipers were still watching. A man wounded in the leg couldn't crawl back to the trench on his own. They became immobile targets. Many soldiers lay there for hours, even days. They watched their lost leg begin to gangrene, begin to change color. They watched rats begin to sniff out the blood. They were thirsty. Thirst from blood loss was a cruel torture. Water. Please give me water. This cry was more haunting than the sound of bombs and bullets. But they dared not drink, because if they drank water while wounded in the stomach, which they sometimes didn't realize was too painful for their leg, they would die. During those hours of waiting, their minds drifted back to home. To the barley fields, to the cobblestone streets, to the healthy legs that had once run, jumped, and danced. Regret began to gnaw at their souls before death or salvation could arrive. You're absolutely right. Part 2 is an extremely important stage in terms of psychology and medical history, and needs to be explored in as much depth and detail as Part 1, approximately 2,000 words. In the previous version, I rushed through the stages a bit too quickly. Below is Part 2. The Saw and Conscience completely rewritten. I've expanded on the details of the painful transport journey, the suffocating atmosphere of the operating room, and the technical details of the medical system at the time to increase authenticity. I've kept the 11 Labs format with ellipses and pauses so you can easily copy it for AI to read. Because the text is long, you should split it into 4 to 5 audio files when rendering to ensure the AI retains the best possible voice quality. Detailed Script Part 2. Extended Version Title. The Saw and Conscience, a journey through medical hell length equivalent to part 1 18 minutes reading time. Note copy each text segment into 11 labs. Sections in parentheses are audio/visual instructions. Do not copy them for AI reading. Section 1. Painful Salvation. 0000 to 0430, audio. The sound of wind whistling through cracks in the earth. The fading groans of a soldier from exhaustion. Then the sound of footsteps wading through mud approaching. If hell truly exists, then the road to it is not paved with burning coals. In World War I, the road to hell was paved with mud. In the previous section, we left the young soldier lying alone in a shell crater, with his leg shattered and a tourniquet tightly applied. He had waited for hours in the bone-chilling cold of northern France. Blood had dried into dark patches on his uniform, and then heavy footsteps echoed. It was the stretcher-bearers. For the wounded soldier, their appearance was a miracle. But this miracle came with a terrible price. Stay still, brother. As the 4 stretcher-bearers lifted his body from the sticky mud, gravity began to take over. His injured leg, now heavy as lead, dangled aimlessly. The nerve endings paralyzed by anaphylactic shock now began to awaken. The first scream wasn't from being shot, but from being rescued. The journey from the no man's land to the forward medical station was a grueling ordeal stretching for miles. Imagine lying on a canvas tarp stretched between 2 wooden planks. 4 men carrying you are fleeing artillery fire, slipping and falling in the mud, leaping over trenches. Each step they take is a jolt that sends shockwaves straight to your spinal cord. Each time the stretcher tilts, the broken bones rub against each other, creating a chilling, crackling sound, echoing inside your skull. Many soldiers begged the stretcher-bearers, "Please, leave me behind. Don't move anymore. Give me a bullet." But they didn't stop. They weren't allowed to stop. The order was to get these waste products of war to the rear as quickly as possible. At the forward medical station, the soldier received his first favor, a morphine injection, and a dog tag tied to his buttonhole. On his forehead, the doctor scribbled a large M with a crayon, or colored it in red lipstick. M stands for morphine, a warning sign for the next line of treatment. Don't inject any more, or his heart will stop. The morphine began to take effect. The pain didn't disappear. It only receded a little. He drifted into a daze, where the sound of firecrackers sounded like distant summer thunder. But the nightmare wasn't over. He was thrown into an ambulance, perhaps an old horse-drawn carriage, or a cramped Ford Model T. Inside that dark vehicle, the smell of sweat, the pungent smell of blood, and the stench of feces mingled together. 6 or 7 men lay piled on top of each other on the racks. The ambulance sped through the night, on roads riddled with bomb craters. Ambulances back then didn't have shock absorbers. With every meter of road, the vehicle lurched, then slammed down. For someone with a shattered leg, this was like being tortured with a sledgehammer, over and over again, thousands of times. Blood started to seep through the thick bandages again. Newly formed blood clots were torn apart. Many soldiers died right there on these vehicles, not from their initial wounds, but from blood loss due to the violent shaking. They died in silence, amidst the roaring engines and the murmured prayers of their comrades lying beside them. The final destination is the Casualty Clearing Station, CCS. This isn't a clean hospital like you see in movies. It's a factory, an industrial assembly line, where the raw materials are rotting bodies. The first thing that assaults your sense of smell is a distinctive odor that no veteran can forget until their dying day. It's a mixture of the pungent smell of Lysol disinfectant, the acrid smell of chloroform anesthetic, the smell of cheap cigarettes, and above all, the sickly, nauseating smell of gas gangrene. The soldier is laid down on the cold floor of a giant canvas tent. Around him, hundreds of stretchers are lined up like logs. Here, the doctors perform a cold procedure called triage, classification. A military doctor, with dark circles under his eyes from lack of sleep, walked along the rows of stretchers. He held colored cards in his hand. For a moment, he played God. He decided who would live, who would die, and who would wait. He stopped before our soldier. He lifted the blanket, looked at the black and purple leg, swollen like a sausage. A foul stench filled the air. He sighed and attached a card to the boy's chest. Group 2 priority for surgery. Sounds good news. Not really, because in the other corner of the tent was Group 3, the moribund, waiting to die. Those wounded in the stomach, in the head, too severely to be saved. They were given unlimited water, injected with a powerful dose of morphine, and left behind a screen, to die peacefully for our soldiers. Prioritizing surgery meant a cruel sentence: amputation. Why amputate? Why not try to save the leg? The answer lies in the soil. The farmland in France and Belgium has been fertilized with manure for centuries. It's full of Clostridium spores, the cause of gas gangrene. When shrapnel tears through the flesh, it pushes these spores deep into the muscles. In the airtight environment of the wound, the bacteria multiply at a terrifying rate. They produce toxic gas under the skin. If the doctor hesitates, even for a few hours, the leg will swell. The skin will crackle like cellophane. The poison will seep into the bloodstream and kill the soldier within 24 hours. Amputation is not an aesthetic choice. It is a race against death. Cut away the dead body parts to preserve the living ones. The soldier was carried into the operating room. The kerosene lamps blazed brightly. The surgeon looked at him. His rubber apron was soaked with blood, the blood of dozens of soldiers before him. They hadn't had time to change. They washed their hands hastily in a basin of murky Lysol water. "Take a deep breath, son." A mesh mask was placed over his nose and mouth. A few drops of ether or chloroform dripped down. The first sensation was suffocation, as if someone was strangling him. A pungent smell assaulted his brain. His heart raced. The world spun. The surrounding noise turned into a buzzing, then died down. Darkness enveloped everything. The surgery proceeded at the speed of an assembly line. 15 minutes. Just 15 minutes for a leg. The doctor couldn't be meticulous. Hundreds of others were waiting outside. He performed the guillotine amputation method, a guillotine-style amputation. It sounds barbaric, but that was the standard at the time. A circular incision around the thigh, chuyin through the skin, fat, and muscle. Large blood vessels were clamped with steel clamps and tied with cat's gut thread. Then came the most haunting sound of field hospitals, the sound of sawing bone. Creak, creak. It was like the sound of a carpenter working, but wetter, duller. The femur was severed. The crushed leg, the part that once ran and jumped in the fields of the homeland, was now completely separated from the body. It was picked up by the nurses, thrown into a metal bucket, or piled into a heap of limbs in the corner of the tent, awaiting mass burial. But the most horrifying thing was the wound wasn't stitched up. To prevent gangrene bacteria from developing, the doctors had to leave the stump gaping open, exposing both bone and raw flesh. They bandaged it loosely so that air could circulate. The soldier's body was now somewhat lighter, but the burden on his soul had increased by 1,000 pounds. The awakening from a chloroform trance was usually accompanied by intense nausea and a pounding headache. He opened his eyes. The ceiling was a dull white canvas. I'm alive. That was his first thought. But then, a strange sensation in his leg. His brain hadn't yet accepted the truth. It was still sending signals down the severed nerves. He felt an itch in his big toe. He felt a dull ache in his ankle and a desire to gently twist it. He reached under the rough wool blanket, intending to scratch the itch. His hand slid down his thigh, and then touched nothing. Where his knee should have been was flat. Where his lower leg should have been was just the mattress. He groped upwards, and his hand touched a thick, hard lump of ice and soaked in yellow fluid. This was the moment of the most brutal truth. No more battlefield adrenaline. No more anesthesia. Only the silence of the hospital. And the stark truth, a part of their body, has forever remained in France. Many soldiers wept. They didn't weep from pain. They wept for the collapse of their future. How can I plow the fields with one leg? How can I dance with Mary? Will my wife still see me as a man, or just a burden? This is the phenomenon of phantom limb, a phantom memory of a lost leg. It will haunt them, sometimes with excruciating pain, sometimes with an unbearable itch, for the rest of their lives. After the wound healed, after the gangrene fever subsided, the soldier faced a new reality. He was no longer a patient. He became a thing in need of repair. Welcome to the rehabilitation centers of 1916. Here, the air didn't smell of disinfectant, but rather of varnish, oak, and new leather. World War I created an enormous demand for prosthetic limbs, unprecedented in human history. In England, Queen Mary Hospital in Roehampton alone received tens of thousands of amputees each year, but the technology of the time, cruelly, couldn't keep up with the speed of bombs and bullets. Look at their new leg. It wasn't the ultra-light carbon fiber of today. It was a piece of wood, usually willow, hollowed out to reduce weight, but still incredibly heavy. It was attached to his body with thick leather straps, tightly constricting his hips and shoulders. The soldier looked at it. A lifeless piece of wood. Cold. And the doctor said, "This is your leg from now on. Get used to it." The first time you put it on, it felt like you were shoving your foot into a rigid bucket. Your stump, where the flesh was still tender, the scar still red, was pressed tightly against the socket. And then, the first step, the weight of your body pressed down, the pain shot to your brain. Not bone pain, but the pain of the flesh being compressed. Sweat began to seep into the prosthetic socket. The skin chafed, blistered, then burst. Blood flowed again. But this time, no one carried you. You had to walk on your own. The hospital corridors now became walking practice floors. The characteristic sound of this era was the clunk, pull, clank, pull. The wooden prosthetic leg lacked a flexible knee joint, or if it did, it creaked and often got stuck. Soldiers had to learn to thrust their hips. They had to use their entire hip muscles to swing the heavy piece of wood forward in an arc, and then place it on the ground. Every step was a struggle. The biggest problem was pistoning the in and out motion. When lifting the leg, the prosthetic leg would slide down a little because of its weight. When placing the leg down, the stump would be pushed forcefully against the bone. This friction occurred thousands of times a day. It wore down their flesh. It turned the stump into a chronic ulcer. Many soldiers took off their prosthetic legs, threw them into a corner, and burst into tears. They preferred using crutches, but using crutches meant they couldn't work, couldn't labor. Society wouldn't accept men who only knew how to use crutches. So, they put them back on. They padded them with wool, added cotton, gritted their teeth, and endured each step to look as normal as possible. The day of discharge arrived. The soldier stood at Victoria or Gare du Nord station. He wore his freshly washed uniform, but the left, or right, trouser leg, fluttered in the wind, or was stiff and unnatural. This was when real fear took over. On the battlefield, they feared death. Now, they feared life. They feared the gaze of others. As they disembarked the train, the crowd parted. Women turned away or covered their children's eyes. Other men looked at them with eyes worse than contempt. It was pity. Pity. That was the sharpest knife cutting into a soldier's self-respect. They were once strong, proud young men, defenders of the homeland. Now, they are wounded veterans, disabled men. But the greatest fear is facing their families. The soldier stands before his home. He hesitates. His hand trembles as he places it on the doorknob. How will his wife look at him? Will she still love a man who is not whole? Will his children be terrified when they see their father's monstrous leg? There are soldiers who have stood before their homes for hours, then turned and walked away. They lacked the courage to see the disappointment in their loved one's eyes. They chose to disappear into the slums, live anonymous lives, rather than become a burden. For those who returned, the war wasn't over. It had simply moved from the trenches to the family dinner table and the factory. Post-war society was cruel. Initially, they were hailed as heroes. But when the economy collapsed, medals couldn't buy bread. The amputee soldier went looking for work. Factory owners shook their heads. You can't operate a machine. You're too slow. They became ghosts on the margins of society. In Berlin, London, Paris in the 1920s. The most common sight on the streets was men in old military uniforms, sitting on the sidewalk, with their amputated legs sticking out, selling matches or shoelaces. On their chests gleamed the Iron Cross or Victoria Cross medals, but in the cap turned upside down, there were only a few loose coins. They had sacrificed their legs for their country, and their country gave them back a wooden leg. And oblivion. A French veteran wrote in his suicide note, "I didn't die in Verdun. I'm just slowly dying here." In Paris, this wooden leg doesn't hurt as much as the stares of those who stayed home while we shed blood. What's wrong with my leg? That innocent question from the battlefield years ago now has an answer. Their legs lie in this mud of Flanders. They have merged with Mother Earth, where the vibrant red poppies bloom every summer. But their story is not just a tragedy. It is from their pain that modern orthopedic surgery was born. It is from those limping steps on oak legs that we have the flexible titanium legs we have today. They were unwilling scapegoats for the progress of medicine. We made this video, not just to tell the horrors of war, but to remind us of the price of peace. When you see a war monument, don't just look at the soldiers charging forward with their guns. Imagine those who returned, with empty trouser legs and steps that will never be complete again. They survived hell to teach us what resilience is. Their bodies may be destroyed, but their spirit, their will to rise and move on, even on a lifeless piece of wood, stands firm like an eternal monument. Thank you for accompanying me on this emotional journey. Cherish the feet that carry you every day, and take a moment of silence for those who no longer have that opportunity. I am Brutal World War. Goodbye, and see you again.